Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot returned something buried under his barn. It didn't take, it gave back. Before we begin, take a moment to comment. Your city, where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind tore across the open plains, carrying with it the dry scent of brittle grass and whipping red dust along the trail that led to a lonely ranch. Somewhere out there, the echo of hoofbeats mingled with the lonesome cry of a harmonica, its notes stolen by the night breeze. In the dead chill of night beneath the creak of weathered boards, a strange sound rose from under the horse stable, a steady, relentless digging, as though something long buried was fighting its way back to the surface. When the rancher pulled the door wide, the lantern's glow cut through the dark, and there it stood, Bigfoot. Its massive frame cast a shadow across the ground, its giant hand clutching a bundle wrapped in mud-stained cloth. It did not snarl, it did not strike, it simply laid it down. And in that moment, fear gave way to something deeper, something raw and human. For the creature the world branded a monster had returned something long lost. Not every sound in the night foretells danger. Montana, late 19th century. Out where the high plains stretched all the way to the horizon, the dry grass bent low beneath the wind, and the dark pine forests loomed like a wall, guarding the hidden mysteries of the earth. There, standing alone against time, was an old wooden ranch house. Its roof tiles had faded gray, the horse stable groaned with every gust, as if it too were fighting to endure. Its master was Elias Carter, a rancher in his 40s, a veteran scarred by years of war. He lived alone, his weary eyes lined deep, his calloused hand, never far from the revolver that had long since become an extension of his own body. In this unforgiving West, he was at once herdsman, watchman, and wanderer, burdened by a past no one else could truly know. That night, as the wind whistled through the cracks of old boards, Elias caught a sound unlike any he'd heard before. It wasn't the cry of wolves. It wasn't the ring of hoofbeats across the dry earth. It was the hollow scrape of something digging beneath the barn floor. His heart tightened, his mind strung taut as a wire. For in the West, no sound ever came in the night without carrying a warning. Lantern trembling in his hand, Elias walked toward the noise, torn between caution and curiosity, every step feeling like a line between survival and fate. And then a question rose. Not only for Elias, but for you listening now. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. The sound beneath the floor. The wind moaned across the prairie, lifting swirls of red dust beneath a moon half hidden by drifting clouds. Against that endless expanse, the silhouette of Elias Carter's ranch stood silent and solitary, like the last outpost of a man with nowhere left to go. In the heart of night, only the barn's timbers groaned, and the horse chains clinked in rhythm with the wind. Inside the stalls, the animals snorted uneasily, hooves striking the packed earth in restless fear. Elias sat alone in the kitchen, a revolver within reach, the dim lantern's glow breathing shadows across his lined face. He was a man well acquainted with silence, but this night, that silence was torn apart. From beneath the barn floor came a sound. At first a faint scratching like a rat in the grain, but it grew heavier, deeper, relentless until the ground itself seemed to shudder. Dust drifted down through the cracks, the old beams trembling. Elias held his breath. He had heard every kind of noise a battlefield could conjure, but this made his heart hammer in his chest. Rising slowly, lantern in one hand, his Colt .45 in the other, he stepped into the dark. "Not beast," he muttered under his breath. Voice raw, then maybe devil. The yard was awash in shadows, the night pressing in heavy. The wind lashed the brittle grass, and every step Elias took crunched on hard frozen soil. The lantern light skimmed across a broken fence, across faded hoofprints in the dirt. Far off, he thought he heard the lonely wail of a harmonica, perhaps only memory carried from the battlefield. Then thump, a hollow crash beneath the barn. The horses screamed and kicked, dust sifting down in angry clouds. Elias raised his pistol, heart clamped in his chest. The door rattled against its frame. From the cracks seeped a breath of cold, damp earth. Elias pressed his ear close. He could hear it, digging, pushing, something big. Too big for any rodent, too heavy for any wolf. He drew in a steadying breath and shoved the door wide. The hinges wailed, the lantern light spilled inside, trembling across swirling motes of dust. Horses reared and snorted, eyes rolling white, their breath fogging the air. And then the ground beneath him quaked. The boards trembled, dust rained down in sheets. A pounding rose beneath the floorboards like something vast and alive, forcing its way upward. The earth split open. Enormous, fur-covered hands clawed through, tearing the boards aside. Elias froze. A colossal figure heaved itself into the light, taller than any man's shoulders, broad as a doorway chest, rising and falling with thunderous breaths. Its eyes, amber and unblinking, burned like lanterns in the dark. Elias leveled his Colt, but the creature did not roar. It did not lunge. It simply stood there, its breath heavy as canyon wind, and in its massive hands, something wrapped in cloth, caked with mud. Sweat chilled Elias's brow. A lifetime alone had taught him to see threat in everything unknown. Yet this monster didn't strike. It only stood silent, waiting. The horses shrieked. The wind tore at the barn walls. Elias could hear his own pulse pounding like war drums. He remembered the nights in battle, how, when he looked into the eyes of his enemies, he sometimes saw not rage, but the same fear and pain that haunted him. Now, staring into those golden eyes, he saw something he never expected: a plea. "What in God's name are you?" he rasped. The beast gave no answer. Slowly, carefully, it crouched and placed the bundle on the boards. Its great hand trembled once, then withdrew. Elias lowered his gun only slightly. His chest swelled with fear, tangled with something else, something dangerously close to wonder. This was no ordinary night. This was a crossing point between what had been buried and what had been returned. Kneeling, Elias touched the bundle. The cloth was damp with fresh earth. The smell of soil filled his lungs. He looked up. The creature hadn't moved. It only watched, its gaze fixed on him as though inviting him to see what lay within. The lantern's glow wavered, throwing both their shadows long against the wall, a lonely man and a legend of the wilderness divided only by a parcel risen from the depths. Elias swallowed, hard fingers brushing the knot of the cloth. Whatever was inside had been unearthed for him, and it would change his life forever. Now I'll leave the question to you. If you heard strange digging beneath your barn on a night like this, would you have drawn your gun or stepped closer to see what was being unearthed? Part 2. The Encounter. The lantern's glow flickered across the barnyard shadows, leaping with every gust. Dust rose in spirals carried by the cold night wind swirling past Elias Carter. As he stood frozen, Colt raised and steady in his grip. From the broken edge of the pine woods, a massive figure emerged. Shoulders so broad they seemed to block the moonlight, fur dark and dripping with midnight dew. Each step struck the earth like a drumbeat, the sound echoing deep in Elias's chest. The horses shrieked in terror, rattling their chains. Cattle tore through the grassland, their panic rising into the sky like a cry from the west itself, awakened in the dead of night. Elias steadied his aim. The revolver's barrel pointed straight at the creature, but it didn't charge, didn't run, didn't roar. Instead, it clutched something, a bundle wrapped in filthy, mud-soaked cloth, tight against its chest. And in its amber eyes glimmered something Elias could not name. In that instant, Elias knew he was facing a moment beyond the laws of the frontier, where most choices boiled down to one: kill or be killed. His pulse pounded against his temples. He remembered nights in desert combat, sandstorms blinding his eyes, gunfire rattling in the dark, men dying from a single second of hesitation. Out here, hesitation carved graves just as quickly. And yet the silence tonight pressed heavier than gunfire. Bigfoot stood still, its breath curling in white clouds. No advance, no strike. The rage and fear coiled in Elias began to unravel, leaving only a different weight: curiosity. Slowly he lowered the revolver just enough to see more clearly what the beast carried. What could make a creature of legend step out of shadow, not to claim, but to return? The wind howled through the tin roof, keening like a harmonica lost in the distance, pulling at Elias's chest. All of the west seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his choice. He took a cautious step forward. The crunch of his boot on hard soil snapped the silence, and instantly the beast raised its chin, eyes gleaming brighter, but it neither lunged nor retreated. The barnyard was reduced to two silhouettes, one weathered rancher with a gun and one giant holding something in its hands. The space between them hummed like a drawn wire ready to snap. Chains clattered as horses reared. Dust spiraled at their feet. Elias clenched his jaw. He could pull the trigger, and the shot would thunder through the valley like countless others before it. But then another thought rose in him like a whisper. What if it didn't come to kill Bigfoot? Lifted the bundle higher as though presenting it. Its amber gaze softened, not fierce but solemn, almost human. Elias lowered his revolver a little more. His hand trembled not from fear this time, but from something rawer, an ache he hadn't felt in years. For so long he had lived alone, branded an oddity by the townsfolk. To them, Elias Carter was just a broken soldier clinging to relics of a war no one cared to remember. And yet here in the cold breath of midnight, it wasn't a man but a myth that stood before him, offering not judgment, not rejection, but something else. A return. A connection. That night, Elias didn't just see Bigfoot. He saw himself reflected in its eyes, an outcast, misunderstood, still clinging to fragments of a past too heavy to release. The wind surged, snuffing the lantern until only a weak thread of light cast across them both. Bigfoot stepped forward, once placed the bundle on the ground, and bowed its head. Then it stepped back, gaze fixed on Elias. It was no threat, it was an invitation. Elias lowered the revolver at last. His chest pounded like a drum, his breath ragged. He knew if he walked away now, he'd carry the question to his grave. Kneeling, he reached for the bundle, mud clinging to his calloused hand. When he looked up again, those golden eyes still held him, burning steady like a secret fire against the darkness of the west. This was no mere meeting, it was a wordless pact that sometimes what we fear most is the very thing that returns to us what we lost. Now the choice is yours. If you were the rancher that night, face to face with Bigfoot, and it laid something at your feet, instead of striking, would you have trusted it or pulled the trigger? Part 3. The gift from the Earth night lay heavy over the Montana highlands, thick as a damp shroud stretched across the land. No moon, no stars, only the wind clawing through the pines, rattling the old barn walls until they moaned like a wounded beast. Elias Carter knelt on the freshly torn ground, his breath turning to pale mist in the frigid air. Before him lay the bundle, an old mud-soaked cloth parcel sagging with the weight of something inside. The lantern in his hand trembled, its weak glow sliding across streaks of red earth clinging to the fabric. His calloused palm shook as it reached out. He had gripped pistols, reins, and knives all his life without flinching. Yet tonight, with nothing more than a bundle of cloth before him, sweat slicked his hand. Bigfoot stood just a few paces away, its massive form blotting out the darkness itself. Broad shoulders loomed, breath heaving like a storm trapped in a canyon. But it didn't move, didn't snatch the bundle back. It only stood there, a living statue, its golden eyes fixed on Elias, watching, waiting. Elias lowered his head, the glint of his dagger catching the lantern light as he scraped away caked soil from the bundle. The dry rasp of metal on fabric cracked through the silence. Horses shrieked in their stalls, chains clanging like warning bells in the still night. He glanced at the beast. Its amber eyes burned steady, unblinking. And in that stare, Elias read something no animal had ever shown him before expectation. A wordless invitation. "You want me to open it, don't you?" His voice rasped into the silence. No reply, only the hiss of wind and the deep, steady breath of the giant. Drawing a long inhale, Elias found the rusted clasp beneath the mud. With a sharp press, it snapped open. The sound rang out into the dark like a lock breaking inside his own chest. The lid creaked back. A breath of damp earth and mildew rushed out. The lantern flame wavered, spilling its glow over what lay inside, a tarnished military medal and a faded family photograph, yellowed and frayed at the edges. Elias froze. His hand hovered above them, trembling too afraid to touch. His heart slammed against his ribs, each beat like hoofbeats across the dry prairie. His lips parted, but no sound came. The metal, he knew it. Once it had hung proudly on the chest of his father, Jacob Carter, who had defended their frontier homestead when Elias was just a boy. Not a hero to history books, but the only wall that had ever stood between his family and the chaos of the Wild West. That metal had vanished the night Jacob fell wounded in a clash with outlaws along the rails. Elias had searched, had dug through the ruins of a collapsed barn, but found nothing but dirt and grief. And the photograph. God Almighty, the photograph. His mother's gentle face beside the fresh timbered cabin, her hand resting on the shoulder of a boy, no more than 10, Elias himself. Beside them, Samuel, his older brother, bright-eyed and full of fire, the only picture ever taken of them all together. He had thought it gone forever, swallowed by the earth along with the old homestead. Elias lifted the metal at last, cold, unyielding. Yet as it pressed against his palm, heat surged from his hand into his chest. He closed his eyes and memory came roaring back. He was a boy again, perched on the fence rail, watching his father steady a rifle. Gunfire cracked, echoing across the valley, cattle scattering in panic. Dust rolled thick in the air. Jacob turned his gaze stern yet warm. Elias, out here in the West, you never let your hand shake. One bullet can save a life or end one. He saw his mother at the window, stitching shirts by lantern light, humming to drown the wind's howl. He heard Samuel laughing, clapping him on the back, promising they would ride to town together someday, unafraid of anyone's stare. Then the memory broke. Gunfire, sandstorm screaming, a night of chaos. 16-year-old Elias clutching a rifle too heavy for his arms. His father falling the metal, lost in the dark. Samuel vanishing into the storm, never to return. Elias's eyes snapped open. Sweat slicked his brow, though the wind cut bitter cold. The metal and the photograph still lay before him, yet they carried more than metal and paper. They carried the soul of a family lost. He looked up. Bigfoot still watched, unblinking. No snarl, no threat. Only silence and patience, as though it understood that Elias had to weather this storm of memory before he could stand again. Tears welled hot, stinging his eyes. He bit hard against his lip. One drop slipped free, tracing down his weathered cheek. He hadn't cried since the night his father fell. Not on the battlefield. Not when he buried friends. Not through years of solitude. Yet now, over a yellowed photograph and a rusted metal, his heart broke open. Why? His voice cracked. How did you find this? Who put it in your hands? The giant gave no answer. It only drew a deep breath, chest rising, shoulders heaving, its gaze still locked with his. And in that gaze, Elias thought he saw them, his father, his mother Samuel, and himself too, a forgotten man left behind by the world, still clutching what little family he had left. The Montana night grew colder, the wind more cruel. But inside Elias Carter, a fire had been lit once more. Out on the high plains, the wind rose in restless waves, shrieking through the grasslands and bending the brittle stalks until they bowed like worshippers before a storm. Tumbleweeds tore free from the soil, whirling across the darkness like wandering spirits. Farther off, the cattle broke into chaos, lowing, pounding hooves, tearing into the dry ground, their panic rolling across the valley like thunder. The sound shivered through the earth as though a storm were bearing down upon the high country. Elias Carter tightened his grip on the metal in his hand. The cold steel pressed against his palm, a sharp contrast to the fire surging hot in his chest. In the voice of the wind, he thought he heard echoes of the past rifle fire stuttering through desert nights, men screaming against the roar of sandstorms, the hollow thud of bodies striking the earth. He trembled not from fear, but from the force of memory crashing in all at once. On the night his father fell, the wind had screamed like this. The horses had panicked, the cattle had stampeded blind through choking dust. And when it cleared, only emptiness remained. A boy without a father, without a brother. Elias lifted his gaze. The creature stood still, unmoving, as though carved into the mountain itself. Its broad shoulders, its massive frame, its amber eyes glowing in the lantern's last glow, none of it shifted yet. All of it seemed unbearably human. "You know what this means, don't you?" Elias whispered, his voice unsteady. The wind snatched his words and carried them off into the dark. Bigfoot tilted its head slightly, as though it had heard, as though it understood, and as though it knew no answer was needed. In the barn, the horses stamped and cried out, iron chains clashing like frantic bells. One kicked loose its latch and burst into the night hooves, drumming across the yard until the sound scattered into the hills. That wild thunder carried with it a message Elias could not mistake. This was no ordinary night. And yet, within the storm of it all, he felt something he hadn't known in years. Not isolation, not suspicion, not exile, but warmth. For the townsfolk had always marked him an outsider, that odd Carter fellow, they'd mutter. A war veteran who clung too hard to the past, a rancher too stubborn to sell his land, too strange to be trusted. In the saloon, voices would drop the moment he stepped inside. He never argued. He simply tipped his hat, bought what he needed, drank his whiskey, and rode home alone. But now tonight it was not men who returned to him what he'd lost. It was a legend. A beast the world called a monster had given him back a medal, a photograph, and a piece of his soul. The cold wind tore at his coat, stinging his skin, but Elias felt only warmth inside, as if unseen hands long gone rested on his shoulders. His mother's calm, his father's steadiness, his brother's laughter. The past was not gone. It had been returned. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, as though answering the gaze that held him. There, in the pale moonlight that had finally broken through the clouds, Elias stood with the relics of his family clutched close, the metal cut into his palm sharp and real. The photograph quivered in the wind, but its faces, his mother's smile, his father's stern pride, Samuel's unshaken confidence, shone clear as the day they were taken. He looked back into the amber eyes across from him and saw himself reflected there, not a monster, not a soldier, not an outcast, but something more, something the world had never allowed him to be. Understood. His voice rasped low, breaking under the weight of it all. Maybe. We're not so different, you and I. Bigfoot made no sound. Its fur rippled under the wind, its stance solid as stone. Yet Elias knew the eyes had heard him. And then came the gesture. The beast stepped once heavy upon the earth, then placed its hand across its own chest. When it lifted its gaze again, its eyes blazed gold in the silver moonlight. A vow without words. I have returned what was yours. The rest is in your hands. A sound rose from its chest, a low, mournful rumble, more mountain than animal. Not threat, not fury. A sorrow ancient and deep. Then it turned, retreating into the timberline, each step sinking into the night, until only shadows remained. Elias stood in the yard, the wind howling past, the metal clenched in one hand, the photograph pressed to his chest. Tears carved hot lines down his weathered face. For the first time since boyhood, he did not feel alone. The prairie wind carried the dust upward, scattering it into the starlight, now breaking through the clouds. Elias lifted his face, and in that moment he knew his life had turned onto a road from which there was no return. Because tonight, the darkness had not only brought back a memory, it had given him a gift from the earth. Now I leave you with a question. If one night something long lost from your family, a medal, a photograph, a memory was returned, not by human hands, but by a creature of legend, would you see it as fate or as a warning? Part 4. The Eyes That Lingered. The towering shadow of Bigfoot retreated slowly toward the tree line, each step heavy enough to thrum through the earth. Branches cracked under its weight, pine needles fell in a rain of silver, and the cold night air swelled until it seemed the whole plain was holding its breath. Moonlight spread thin across the cracked prairie painting, the dust still curling in the wind like gun smoke that refused to clear. Elias Carter stood frozen in the yard, the relics clutched tight in his hand. His chest heaved, his heart still stumbling against the storm inside him. The horse in the stall thrashed and snorted, its eyes rolling white. But Elias no longer shook. Fear had been replaced by something he could not yet name, a strange, piercing connection. The beast's massive frame drifted toward the black edge of the pines. It was nearly gone when it stopped. It did not vanish, did not turn fully away. It simply stood at the border of shadow and light shoulders broad enough to cast a wall of darkness across the brittle grass. The wind rose, tearing dust and weeds through the air. And in that instant, Elias was thrust back into memory, into nights of sandstorms on foreign soil when chaos swallowed men whole, and all he had left was the desperate certainty in another man's eyes. A look that said, "I am still here. I am still alive." And now, on this Montana night, he found that same look shining back at him. Bigfoot turned its head. Its amber eyes flared through the dark. Not a threat, not a warning, a farewell, a charge. Elias tightened his grip on the metal, the sharp edge biting into his palm. His father's eyes had once held that same weight the day he fell, no words, only a final look that carried every lesson a son would ever need. The coat snapped against his frame, the cold biting hard, but inside him burned a fire he had not felt in decades. His voice broke, ragged as stone, I understand. But by then, the creature had turned. The forest swallowed its massive frame, leaving behind only the memory of those eyes etched into Elias's mind like a scar carved fresh. The silence that followed was not empty. It pressed against him, filled with echoes of things long buried, the barn roof creaking, the moan of the wind, and his heartbeat loud as a war drum, as if calling him to a battle yet to come. A memory rose unbidden. Elias saw himself again at 13, his father's weathered hand guiding a rifle into his grasp. The sun had burned hot, the dust swallowing the horizon. Jacob Carter's voice had carried across the prairie. "Listen, son. When you look a man in the eye before you pull the trigger, sometimes you'll see yourself in him. If all you see is an animal, then fire. But if you see a man, remember a gun doesn't always give the right answer." Those words had drifted away over the years, buried under suspicion and loneliness. In town, when people stared at him, Elias had seen no humanity, only doubt and judgment. They hadn't looked at him as a man, only as an oddity, a soldier too broken to move on. But tonight, in the amber gaze of a legend, Elias saw something different. He saw another outcast surviving the wild, as he had survived the war. A being that belonged nowhere and yet still carried a fragment of humanity inside. The wind lashed his face with brittle stalks of grass. He closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat he swore he heard hoofbeats pounding across the plain. First steady, then frantic, just like the night his father fell, just like the night Samuel, his brother, had shouted, "Run, Elias." But he hadn't run. He had stood frozen, watching his father collapse into the storm, clutching a rifle too heavy for his hands. And in that last instant, Jacob's eyes had burned into him, silent, searing, eternal. The same eyes that met him tonight through the veil of myth. Elias's eyes snapped open. The forest was dark, the night pitiless, but he could still feel that amber gaze. It stretched across years, pulling the ghosts of his past into the present. His voice cracked into the emptiness, trembling a confession to the night itself. "Father, was it you who sent it?" No answer came, only the depthless silence of the western wilds. But Elias understood. The past was no longer a burden chained to his back. Tonight, it had been returned to him as a gift and as a reminder. The massive shadow of Bigfoot receded into the tree line, each footfall shaking the ground as if the earth itself marked its passage. Branches cracked, pine needles fell like rain, and the night air swelled taut as a drum. The moon cast pale silver across the prairie, catching on the dust still rising in swirls like battlefield smoke that refused to lift. Elias Carter remained rooted in the barnyard. Fingers clenched hard around the metal the photograph pressed against his chest. His heart thundered unevenly, but it no longer beat with fear. Something else had taken its place, something heavier, stranger, a bond. At the edge of the trees, the giant paused. It did not vanish into shadow. It did not turn fully away. Instead, it stood there, half in darkness, half in moonlight, shoulders like a wall as if it were waiting. The wind ripped through the yard, spinning grass and dust until Elias could barely see. And in that whirling haze, memory struck him, memories of sandstorms on the battlefield, men disappearing into chaos, and the desperate moments when all he had to cling to was the look in another man's eyes. Eyes that said, "I am here. I am still alive." And then those amber eyes gleamed from the tree line. Not wild, not cruel. A farewell and something more, a charge, a weight to carry. Elias's throat tightened. He remembered Jacob Carter, his father, on that day, so long ago, his body falling, his eyes lingering on his son in one final wordless message. Now, decades later, that same gaze burned through the night. The metal cut deep into his palm, the pain sharp, grounding him. The cold wind lashed at his coat, but his chest blazed with a fire long lost. He whispered, voice graveled and raw, "I understand." But the creature had turned, swallowed by the black canopy of trees. All that remained was the stare etched into Elias's mind like a scar burned fresh. The silence afterward was thick but not empty. It was filled with the creak of old tin, the sigh of grass, and the relentless pounding of Elias's own heartbeat. And then came memory again, a boy of 13, the weight of a rifle too big for his hands, his father's voice steady as stone. When you look a man in the eye before pulling the trigger, sometimes you'll see yourself in him. If all you see is an animal, then fire. But if you see a man, remember, a bullet isn't always the right answer. For years, Elias had forgotten those words, smothered by suspicion, by the judgment of townsfolk who looked at him and saw only an oddity, a broken soldier. But tonight, in the golden gaze of a legend, he had seen it something human, something he understood. He whispered into the emptiness, almost like a prayer, "Father, was it you who sent it?" No voice replied, only the silence of the wilderness, deep and merciless. But Elias knew. The past had been returned not as a burden, but as a gift, a reminder. The forest grew still, but in his chest the warmth lingered. He would never again look upon his ranch as a fortress of solitude. Tonight it had become something else, ground hallowed by the crossing of man and myth. He turned at last toward the cabin, the metal and photograph clutched close. His boots struck the hardpan earth in steady rhythm, each step echoing like a drum of resolve. At the door he stopped, glanced back once more. The forest was dark, the giant gone. But in his mind the amber eyes still burned, carved into memory like a mark on wood. Eternal. "If ever you return," he whispered, "I'll be waiting." Inside, the firelight caught his face, lined, weary, yet lit by something new. Outside, the wind carried through the high plains, no longer a threat, but a vow, the sound of a covenant sealed in silence. Now let me ask you, if you had stood where Elias stood that night, gazing into the eyes of a legend that seemed to know your pain, would you have turned away, or carried that gaze in your heart forever? Part 5. The Silent Vow. The night had stilled. The forest had swallowed Bigfoot whole, leaving only the barnyard drenched in silver moonlight. Elias Carter stood unmoving, the metal clutched tight in his hand, the worn photograph pressed close to his chest. Around his boots, the wind swirled the dry prairie grass in slow circling eddies like the wheel of memory closing upon itself. The ranch lay stranded in the vast expanse, an island of weathered boards and broken fences, adrift in a sea of red earth. The stable had quieted the horses' frantic breaths, fading into uneasy sighs. In the distance, the cattle settled, their voices dissolving into the eternal chorus of the west, the cry of wind, the bend of grass, and somewhere far away the echo of gunfire reminding him that this land was never free of danger. Elias tightened his grip until the veins stood out on his hand. For the first time in decades, he felt them near his father, his mother Samuel, watching him through this night. He was alone, and yet he was not. He lifted his gaze toward the dark timberline and whispered, "Thank you." He knew the creature would never hear. But the words needed to be spoken, cast into the night like an oath, an unspoken covenant between man and legend. On the high plains, the wind never rests. It carried back to him the voices of old, the thunder of hooves, the howl of sandstorms, the cries of war. He saw himself again, young and isolated, perched on the fence while other children laughed in the town square. He remembered the stares of grown men, hard suspicious. Jacob Carter's boy, they muttered. That family will never know peace. He had grown accustomed to silence, to standing on the edges of life, a shadow no one let in. And as war came, as loved ones vanished, as years hardened into solitude, that shadow deepened. But tonight, in the gaze of a creature the world named a monster, Elias had been given something no man had ever offered him: recognition. A look without judgment. A look that said, "You matter." That was why his whisper of thank you was not only for Bigfoot, it was for the boy he once was and the man who had survived. He stepped inside the cabin but did not strike a match. Instead, he laid the medal and the photograph upon the table. Moonlight poured through the narrow window, bathing them until they glowed brighter than any flame. He set his rough hand over them, closed his eyes. The chill of steel and faded paper seemed to warm beneath his touch. Not the fire of bitterness, not the fire of loneliness, but the fire of a promise. A vow that he would no longer live as an exile, but as the keeper of this memory, the same way Bigfoot had kept it and returned it. Beyond the walls, the wind lifted again, long and hollow, almost like a voice calling his name. Elias raised his head, eyes burning bright in the dark. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if he would ever see the creature again. But he knew this tonight had changed the course of his life. Tomorrow he would ride down into town. He would walk the same dust-choked street, feel the same eyes follow him with doubt. But within him would live a secret they would never grasp. He and Bigfoot, two outcasts misunderstood by the world, had crossed paths not in violence, but in an act of kindness. No blood, no bullets, no oaths, only a gift from the earth, a look and a whispered thank you. And that was stronger than any tie forged by man, stronger than suspicion, stronger than fear. Elias stepped out onto the porch. The moon stood high, silvering the plains to the horizon. Somewhere in the timberline he thought he heard a low breath, as if the creature lingered still. He gripped the metal tight, pressed the photograph to his chest, and nodded once, not to the night, but to the vow he had just set into his heart. I will keep this. I will not let memory be buried again. And if ever you return, I will be here. The wind surged, flinging his coat wide, lifting the red dust in a swirl that scattered into the sky. Elias whispered once more, letting the gale carry it beyond the plains. Thank you. And in that moment, man and legend touched, not through power, not through blood, but through a quiet act of grace. That, Elias thought, was the truest law of the West, that in a land of storms, gunfire, and endless suspicion, it is the smallest moments of kindness that can remake a life. Now I ask you, if you were Elias that night, holding your family's memories in one hand and the silence of a legend in the other, what would you have whispered into the dark? The morning after, the sun rose slow over the far ridge, its pale gold light spilling across the battered roof of the old barn. On the ground, damp earth still bore the imprint of enormous feet marks, too deep, too wide to ever be mistaken for man. Morning mist lifted from the prairie like gun smoke, lingering after a battle, curling ghost-like into the air. Elias Carter stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the dark line of forest. In his weathered hand, the metal and the faded photograph still clung to traces of soil, glinting faintly in the new day's light. He did not know if the creature would ever return. But deep inside, he knew one truth with certainty: what had happened in the night was no dream. There are debts that can never be repaid in words, only in deeds. And there are eyes seen only once that can alter the course of a man's life forever. Elias gave a slight nod, a wordless greeting cast toward the timberline. Then he turned for the barn, fingers gripping the relics as if they were lifelines. The ranch would fall silent again. There would be nights when the wind howled and mornings when the townsfolk's suspicious stares weighed heavy on him. But from this day forward, he knew he was not entirely alone. He whispered into the breeze a promise carried across the wide plains: I'll be waiting. And in that moment, The West was no longer only a land of gunsmoke and solitude. It had become something more, a place where man and legend could meet, if only through a single act of quiet grace. Now I'll leave the question with you. If a creature of legend returned something precious to you, what would you do? Share your thoughts below. And if you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments. Let me know in